But seriously, I'm Warren Spector.
I'm David Swansbuckle.
And together we are Wild Stallions. No, we are the Metropolitan Elites and the left-wing
Lizard Overlords.
rung us up and said the following. We're talking about the BBC. Once again, this is second in our series of BBC stuff, where we talk about the BBC and about the potential bias of the BBC. Is there a potential bias of the BBC? I'm not sure. At this stage, is any of your opinions changed at all from what we've set out as?
Not really.
No, we're just too entrenched in our ivory-towered liberal woolliness to be changed. That's what it is. We just can't see the truth. There was a great programme on BBC 4. I know you don't watch BBC 4, but we do. About some interesting historical communications that have taken place in the BBC over the years, which is really interesting. Again, you see the disconnect between people making the decisions at the top and the people actually working there. And I think it's relevant that a lot of the criticism is either levied at one or the other by different people. When Arthur Lowe of Dad's Army fame was auditioning, originally he was considered only good enough for the Midlands, which made me laugh. So, there was definitely a disconnect there, whereas obviously there were people in the BBC who were big fans of him and wanted him, on different shows and things like that. And with Dad's Army, there was actually a clash between the head of comedy and the controller of BBC One. And originally the titles for Dad's Army were the idea was that there was going to, there were Nazis and there were refugees and things superimposed on the actors to really emphasise what the programme's about, and it was like they weren't taking it seriously, and it's that thing again about business people interfering in the arts, which is always a problem, and that's what gave us the dome. I suppose what's significant about Dad's Army is that the controller, the guy who didn't want it, had to acquiesce for Dad's Army, and of course it was a huge success, etc. And I think it's a recurring theme about those in power not liking things that people will like. So if for a moment, if we talk about the BBC sceptics, who are they complaining about? That's the question. Are they complaining about those at the top, or are they complaining about Lenny Henry? That's the interesting thing, and really, different people are complaining about different things. And anything that someone's complaining about it in the opposite direction as well. So I'm still not really getting anywhere, in a way. And that I'm finding evidence of bias, and then I'm finding evidence of bias in the other direction as well. So, as of now, we're still at number one, really. If anything, I'm more towards the notion that the BBC are not biased.
Did you listen to that thing on Radio 4 this week? Peter Oborne investigation HSBC?
I didn't listen to it.
No. Basically, Peter Oborne had to give up his job as political editor at the Daily Telegraph over this because they wouldn't publish a story, because HSBC was one of the major advertisers in the newspaper. Mm-hmm. And the BBC offered him the opportunity to get this story out, so he worked on it. The show was only half an hour long. It wasn't that controversial actually, but basically a couple of prominent Muslims who had taken over the mosque where Abu Hamza, was it? Or Abu Qatada had been preaching, mm-hmm. and they'd sort of gone in and sort of cleaned it up and weeded out all the nasty people out of there. But they'd had their accounts summarily closed by HSBC, no explanation, just told that basically you've got 30 days or something like that to get all your money out, but if you want us to close it sooner than that, then we will. And the report was basically found that there was a database with suspected terrorist activities on there, and there was actually some connection with Saudi Arabia, something like that. It said that these guys were potentially terrorists, and HSB had to act on that because they were being hounded by the American government and UK governments for not putting in pressure on or dealing with terrorists and their accounts and stuff like that. Yeah. But the point is, that demonstrates the value of the BBC.
Yeah, right.
The BBC aren't beholden to any advertisers, corporate entities that could put pressure on them. Though sometimes I think that they are.
That's the problem.
They don't have to be, because they are independent and they have an independent source of revenue. So if you change the BBC model to one that receives advertising, then
it won't be the BBC.
Then you lose that.
Yeah.
Peter Oborne, he's no lefty.
There you go. Exactly. That's the whole thing. And if you look at it historically, it is a miracle we've got this far, and it's still independent-ish. They are obviously, the BBC are beholden to the government, although officially they're not. They are. You can look at lots of examples of where that was. I mean, in 1926, the BBC was, what, 4 years old? I think it was 1922 it started. They were accused of bias because there was a strike. There were lots of people supposed to be striking, and they were accused of bias in favour of the Tory government. And they kind of denied this, but it turned out when they tried to, they wanted to actually transmit some interviews with Labour and the TUC, the government actually prevented them from transmitting the Labour leaders' thoughts on the strike.
It's interesting, isn't it?
So in those days, of course, they could be much more direct about it. When you bring it up to present day, nearly the present day, with David Kelly and Hutton and all that stuff. Of course, what's interesting about that was the BBC reporting against a right-wing Labour Party, actually. Well, they were actually able to transmit that, and then subsequently there was the Hutton inquiry and big whitewash and all that stuff. But is it because it was a Labour Party in power? Did that make a difference? Or is it a right-wing Labour Party in power? Or, don't know. Another one is the stuff about the IRA. And I think it was only the early 80s when they were actually banned from the media, were banned from transmitting the sound of the voice of Martin McGuinness and all those guys. Which is an interesting one, I think. I mean, what were they worried about? And maybe the argument really was it was about propaganda. So maybe that's what it was, But surely, I think it backfired. And it's an interesting thing that the government would do that, would actually ban the voice of someone. You can see them, but you can't hear their voice. Another interesting thing I read about I've read about quite a few interesting things here, but they're not that obscure. I mean, I sort of dug a bit and found some interesting information, and then went back and discovered actually a lot of this is on Wikipedia. But during World War II, suspected communists, their files, because everyone has a file at the BBC, were stamped with a Christmas tree symbol. I won't go into obviously what that sounds like a parallel of, but not suspected Nazis, suspected communists. And apparently this was a secret. Only a few people in the BBC knew what the Christmas tree meant. It was meant they were banned from the BBC for being suspected communists. So there you have a proper McCarthy-esque paranoid craziness going on in the BBC. 10 years later, Churchill decided the Beeb was full of communists, and that was privately, that's what he was saying, and that really was the push to introduce commercial TV. Actually, interestingly, it was actually a deliberate foil to the communist BBC. So commercial TV was supposed to be, I don't know, was it supposed to be fascist? I think that's really interesting. That when, because they did it for the whole of the Cold War. So whilst the BBC were actually secretly banning suspected communists, not actual communists, suspected communists, McCarthy style, Churchill thought they were communists. It's an evil communist organisation. There's a real dissonance there, isn't there? I mean, what is that all about? Do you know about the Balin report? Have you heard about the Balin report? This is an internal report from an investigation in the BBC, where an investigation into bias about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and there was a guy who was fighting to get this thing released, freedom of information, and it's been denied, and then it was appealed, and then the appeal was stopped unanimously by the High Court, interestingly. But then they got round it, and it was actually allowed again. And then the guy died, and then his widow actually tried to get the thing going again, but it was actually denied. It was, we still haven't read the Balin report. The guy that died, who was actually doing it, was Jewish. So whether that means he was seeing it as being pro-Palestine reporting or not, I don't know. But we don't know whether that report says whether they were biased or not, or whether it says actually they're not biased. But the BBC are spending a lot of money, have spent a huge amount stopping that report getting out.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And if we had some information about that, we could discuss it.
Yeah.
But nobody knows. We don't know. And obviously, some people are going to assume, obviously it shows that they have anti-Israel bias, or they have anti-Palestine bias, or we don't actually know. We'll have to break in to BBC and have a read.
Yeah. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, how do you determine if something's biased or not?
That's the question, isn't it? Yeah. And if is it the number of people accusing?
Yeah.
In which case it's equal. They're equally biased
in all directions.
Then it balances out, doesn't it? Or does it mean?
Well, you can take some actual sort of statistical measures of fact. So, we all know that the BBC has a tendency to lean towards the status quo It relies on interviews from government ministers. So whichever party's in power gets the sort of like gets most exposure on the BBC through interviews.
Yeah.
And stuff like that.
It does seem that when they stood against the government in power, which was Tony Blair's New Labour, wasn't it? It was New Labour. That's when the shit hit the fan. Mm-hmm. It does seem like that, doesn't it? And that never really happened before. Not like that.
Well, there is a report out there which shows the amount of interviews at times, like sort of Labour ministers were interviewed during Gordon Brown's prime ministership, and how that changed when David Cameron went about. And actually, there is quite a sharp increase in the amount of interviews the BBC gives to government ministers since the Conservatives come into power, which is interesting. And it's quite marked. It's sort of over 20% more exposure to Tory ministers.
It'd be good to see the Blair years stats on that as well, because obviously there was obviously an anti-Brown message in the whole media, as far as I know. I mean, I don't read the Mirror. Maybe the Mirror really like Gordon Brown. I don't know.
I doubt it.
Mm. So we're not here next week, unfortunately, but we will catch you in 2 weeks' time, and we're going to continue our BBC journey. Bit of a strange one this week, I think, but we had a bit of historical information, which is interesting. I think next time we're going to talk about banned at the BBC. What do they ban and why? And does it make them biased?
Yeah.
See you then.
Bye-bye.